So, Pastor Payne, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, George. Well, if it's okay with you, I'm going to be sitting down for part of the time and walking around for other parts of the time. But first of all, I want to thank you for coming on such a beautiful day. It's already stewardship dedicated to God to bring your bodies inside when there's such a beautiful day outside. So I really appreciate it. And to me, that means you're hungry and wanting to know a little bit more about stewardship. And I think that's great. So I'm looking forward to this time together. I'm going to do some talking, but I'm going to be asking you to do some talking and working as well. And a couple of times during our time together, we'll give you a chance to, we'll stop and break into small groups for a little talking, and that'll give you a chance to walk around so you won't be stuck sitting there for 2 hours straight. I'm delighted to be here in Montana. It's really wonderful to have a chance to see the ELCA and all the different parts of the country. The role that I came in is as Director of Mission Support, and I have the opportunity and the privilege and the fun of visiting all different synods and meeting with our bishops and councils and doing what we call a partnership consultation. We talk about what our partnership means together as all the different parts of the church. But as a part of this, Bishop Jessica Christ asked if I would do a couple of stewardship workshops, and that's been my passion for a long, long time. So I'm looking forward to spending that time with you and talking about that. And I want, during the course of this time, please don't hesitate during the time when I'm just talking. If you have a question, want to ask about something, please just raise your hand or shout it out so that this can be a dialogue and not just a long, boring monologue. But I did, since I got to plan this workshop, I got a chance to share with you one of my very favorite Bible stories. So if you saw the name of the workshop, the name of the workshop is Stirred Hearts and Willing Spirits. And you came with a hope that we could find a way together for you to stir hearts and help make spirits more willing in the congregations where you came from. And I hope that we're going to be able to do that today. But to begin, I'd like to take a look at that story in the Bible. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, so I'll just read it to you. We're not going to actually do a Bible study. But when I found this story a long, long time ago, I was doing stewardship work already, and I thought this was great. Because as I said in the description of the workshop, this is about a building campaign where the people got so excited that they had to tell them to stop bringing gifts and money to the campaign. And that's kind of a fantasy that we all have, I think, a fantasy that the offering will come in and to the church and to building campaigns, and we'll have to say, no, enough, you've given us way too much money. But it's fun to just think about it for a minute. And whenever we spend time with Scripture, we deepen our understanding of how God works in the world. And I think that's a good place to begin whenever we talk about stewardship. So this is a story from the book of Exodus, and if you want to go back when you go home and think about it more or use it in any way in your congregations, it's basically in the 35th and the 36th chapters of Exodus. And Moses has just gone up on the mountain, and he's heard the voice of God, and he's come down and he's brought the commandments. But along with bringing down the commandments for a way of life, he's also brought a task for the people. Moses said to all the congregation of the Israelites, "This is the thing that the Lord has commanded. Take from among you an offering to the Lord. Let whoever is of a generous heart bring the Lord's offering, gold, silver, and bronze, blue, purple, and crimson yarns and fine linen, goat's hair, tanned ram skins, and fine leather, acacia wood, oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil, and for the fragrant incense, and stones and gems to be set in the breastplates." So Moses was inviting the people to bring so many different kinds of gifts to begin to shape a tabernacle and all of the things that went into the tabernacle. "All who are skillful among you shall come and make all that the Lord has commanded. The tabernacle, its tent, and its covering," and it goes on and talks about all the different parts. Nowadays, he would be saying the pews and the fellowship hall and the restrooms and the parking lot and all those different things. So he lists them all, and then he tells the congregation to go and gather the gifts. Then all the congregation of the Israelites withdrew from the presence of Moses, and then they came. Now here's the part that just fascinates me so much because I've always been wanting to dig in and find out just what caused this. Everyone whose heart was stirred and everyone whose spirit was willing and brought the Lord's offering to be used for the tent of meeting and for all its service and for the sacred vestments. So they came, both men and women. I like that too, because it's a big thing to be a man in Judaism in the Old Testament. But Moses invited everyone to bring their gifts, both men and women, all who were of a willing heart. And so they not only brought all those other things, but they brought brooches and earrings and signet rings and pendants, all sorts of gold objects, everyone bringing an offering of gold to the Lord. And then he goes on, all the categories of gifts that the people brought. All the Israelite men and women whose hearts made them willing to bring anything for the work that the Lord had commanded by Moses to be done, brought it as a free will offering to the Lord. The first thing that really struck me about this, besides the stirred hearts and the willing spirit, was how the people brought what they had. The women brought what they had, and the men brought what they had. And the tabernacle and all of the parts of the tabernacle was shaped by the gifts that the people brought. And I think that's the first thing that I want to share with you out of this text. And because we're going to be talking about all kinds of stewardship today, but I'm going to be focusing on financial stewardship, because I think that's one of the hardest things, one of the hardest challenges. But the truth is, stewardship is about all that we have and bringing all that we have. And one of the best ways to form community is to welcome all the gifts, all the different kinds of gifts that the people can bring. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So they go on. And then Moses then called the leaders and every skillful one to whom the Lord had given skill and whose heart was stirred to come to do the work. And they received from Moses all the free will offerings that the Israelites had brought for doing the work on the sanctuary. They still kept bringing free will offerings every morning, so that all the artisans who were doing every sort of task on the sanctuary came, each from the task being performed, and said to Moses, "The people are bringing much more than enough for doing the work that the Lord has commanded us to do." So Moses gave command, and word was proclaimed throughout the camp. No man or woman is to make anything else as an offering for the sanctuary. So the people were restrained from giving. Wouldn't that just be great if we had that problem? That's kind of our fantasy. For what they had already brought was more than enough to do all the work. So this is a story of abundance, and it's repeated in many different places in the Bible. But the most important thing is to learn from this story that God has given us all the things that we need to do the things that God calls us to do. And our challenge is to understand how both to be stewards of them and how to gather the gifts. So I'd like to think with you for a minute. Think about the Israelites then, and think about us now. What is it in the company of the faithful that manages to stir our hearts? When has your heart been stirred, and what caused that?
When we reach out to our community around us.
Okay. You can feel the Spirit at work in your heart when you're in the process of reaching out. Yep, that's one way. What else has stirred your heart?
Helping the young people in our community.
Helping young people, welcoming them and gathering them in. Yep.
Feeding people. Our church has a food pantry. And
Mm-hmm.
we see people come in, and they're welcome to just come in and gather some food, whatever they need, and just seeing that there is such a big need.
Yeah. How about when you just gather as a community? What goes on that makes you feel that God is present, that your hearts are stirred?
Worship. And
Worship.
I'm not talking only about worship in the vertical, but also worship in the horizontal. And if you want to understand more about that, see Pastor Wood.
Music.
Yep. Somebody said yesterday that I hadn't thought of. His heart was stirred by a sense of purpose that the community had, that there was a purpose that was in God's will for the sense of the community. Yeah. Okay, I think all of us, all of you whose hearts were stirred to come today, I bet are faithful members and faithful stewards in your community. But the challenge that we face is, how do we share that? Not everyone's hearts might be stirred by the same things. So how do we begin to develop an understanding of stewardship in our congregations that will make the congregations more lively and healthy and able to touch more and more people and able to stir their hearts? How do we help spirits to be more willing to come to the house of God and to take part in all of our ministries? And in talking about that, we're going to be talking about stewardship. But before I get into what I want to say, I'd like to ask you to tell me, when you came today, what you hoped that you would get out of this time together. What questions or thoughts or concerns that you had, because I want to be sure as we go through the day that we address all of those. So right at the beginning, what were you hoping that I would talk about and that we would have time to discuss and work on today under the general topic of stewardship?
I spoke with you briefly about it this morning, that we're just beginning some work together, so some beginning steps that starts conversation in our congregation.
Uh-huh. It's not always so easy to start conversations about stewardship, is it? What happens when you say the word stewardship to people? Yeah. So we want to start conversations in the congregation about stewardship. What else do you want to talk about or hear about today?
I would just love to have a way to let other people know how blessed and how great it feels to give and what a difference it can make in their own life without going out and saying, look what I did, I gave money.
Yeah.
I mean, it's got to be a way to get the feeling there before, without even saying.
You know, this is the thing that's so frustrating. The joy of giving, I think, is the best kept secret in the Christian faith. Those of us who know the joy, it's hard to communicate it. So that's a really good thing. There and then there. Yep.
So I was hoping to hear something about how stewardship and generosity compare individually.
Interesting. Yep. So let me just write the word generosity. And please be patient with me because I can't always spell when I'm standing up. So if I spell it wrong, just pretend you didn't see. Over here, someone had something.
Yeah, it sort of dovetails with what the other two have mentioned, our response to God's blessings in our lives.
And talk about that a little more. You mean how we create an opportunity for people to respond? Yeah. Okay, anything else that you can think of? As we go along, you can add more things, and I think there'll be opportunities for you to ask me to elaborate on something or talk with yourselves about it. But let's do this next. Because we said we want to start conversations about stewardship in the congregations. Now, when you hear the word stewardship, let's just do a little word association thing. Don't overthink it. Just when you hear the word stewardship, what's the first word that comes to your mind? Just shout it out.
Service.
Anything else? Caretaking. What do you think other people in your congregation might think when they hear the word stewardship? I asked that to somebody once, and she said, well, honestly, when I hear the word, it makes me want to jump up out of the pew and run out of the church. You want my money? Great, yeah.
Think of it as outreach.
Okay, yep. Okay. There's a lot of emotion around this word, and I think this is kind of the tip of the iceberg, but there's more and more that goes on. And as I said, you folks are the faithful folks who are hoping to do this in the congregation. So I think you in particular might not have all of the negative connotations. You really understand the breadth of stewardship and are here to get some tools to help communicate that to other people. So that's great. I'm going to tell you a little story to begin with that is what I think is a good way. It's a way that helped me understand what I think stewardship, the deepest meaning of stewardship, is all about. And then after I do that, we're gonna go into thinking about what some misconceptions are about stewardship. And then we're going to talk about money. We're going to focus on financial stewardship and talk about what the ways are to create an environment in your congregation that really makes the growth of stewards possible. So we're going to spend a lot of time on money and programs and all, but before we begin that, I want to get into just a little bit the deeper meaning of stewardship because it encompasses so much. I think I found out what, for me, communicates the deepest meaning of stewardship from my son many, many years ago. He was about 4 at the time, and he was suffering from an illness and was on medication, and we were told we had to keep a really close eye on him. So we were doing that. And this was during Christmas time in our home, and I walked into the living room one day, and there was my son lying motionless underneath the Christmas tree with his arms and legs spread out and his eyes glazed over, just totally motionless. And you know, a 4-year-old boy is almost never motionless. So he was lying there, and I was so afraid. And I walked over and I said to him, "John?" And in that voice that children save to use on their parents when their parents are being particularly clueless, he said, "Yeah." But he didn't move. And I said, "Well, what are you doing there?" And he said, "I'm finding out what it feels like to be a present." So, and you know, I thought about that. He lay there for a long time, and then he went into his room and started playing with his Matchbox cars. And I went in and I said, did you find out what it feels like to be a present? And he said, "Yep." I said, "Can you tell me about it?" And he said, "Nope." So he transferred the pondering onto me, and the more I've thought about it over the years, the more I've felt that that's really what understanding stewardship is all about. Understanding ourselves as gifts that God is giving to the world in every way, every part of ourselves. Our time and our personality and our intellect and our money, just every part of ourselves is part of the gift that God is giving to the world. And we get named as stewards by Jesus and in the church, but the culture names us as a consumer. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit more lately and later on, but that's what we're battling when we do work in the church. We spend a little bit of time in our congregations trying to name people as children of God and gifts that God is giving to the world. But what they get from the culture and from so many other parts in life is that they are created to consume what is being produced. And that message comes across loud and clear. In fact, one of the scariest programs I ever saw, it was an advertising company describing how the first age group they target for advertising is 18 months. From toddler up, to craft with all these psychological tools, to craft ways of convincing us from little up of all the things that we need. So that's what we're battling against. But it's a beautiful thing to think of ourselves as a gift that God has given to the world, and that plays out in every possible way. So, but you guys are the choir. I'm kind of preaching to the choir here. And so what I'd like to share with you is 5 misconceptions that I think people have that are pretty common misconceptions when they hear the word stewardship. Because when you go back to do stewardship work, you're doing a kind of ministry that will encounter a lot of resistance for a lot of different reasons. So the first most common misconception of stewardship is that the definition of stewardship is that painful but blessedly brief time of year when my church asks me for money. That's just what's in most people's mind when you say the word stewardship. And the church is partly at fault for that, because the word stewardship was invented early in the 19th century by the American church to create a way to raise funds to support the church. So that's how the word was created. In Europe, there are state churches, and the funding of the church is very, very different. But in our country, we needed to create a way to fund the church differently from that. So we created this idea, and programs were usually done in the fall. And that raises the whole specter of what's the difference between biblical stewardship and fundraising. So that's one of the things that you'll be running into. And people, as soon as you say the word stewardship, that's what they'll think. And so we're going to talk later about the importance of doing all kinds of stewardship education throughout the year in the church. And this is the first time to begin to think about how we need to disassociate the broad understanding of stewardship we have from this little fall financial campaign. The second most common misconception that people have that feeds people's willingness to avoid being good stewards is that they say, well, you should never talk about money in church. That's what people say all the time. You should never talk about money in church. Well, here's a little dilemma about that. Jesus talked about money all the time. Throughout the scriptures, Jesus talked about money. In fact, 1/3, literally, a little bit more than 1/3 of all of Jesus' sayings and stories and parables were about money or material possessions and their danger, or the danger of greed. 1/3 of all the things that Jesus said. So we're beginning to get to a place where you can see how important Jesus thought it was for us to tackle this whole issue. If your pastor, the pastor preaches usually according to the lectionary throughout the year. Just imagine if your pastor preached about things in proportion to how Jesus talked about them. Your pastor would preach the most about the kingdom of God, but the second most about money. So it's not true that you shouldn't talk about money in church. In fact, you should talk about money all the time in church in all different ways, because that's one way to begin to take away its power from separating people from God. The third misconception is that the biggest deterrent to generous giving is a low income. And that's just not true. People say, well, if I had more money, I'd give more money. Or people say, well, I have so much money, I can't give that much. The truth is that the biggest deterrent to giving is people not opening their hearts up to the way Jesus talks to us about the power that money and possessions has over us. In the Great Depression, unlike the recent, more minor recession, in the Great Depression, the percentage of giving went up in this country because people understood the need to give even though they were getting so much less themselves. And in our country, if you don't count the major philanthropists, the most money, not percentage-wise, but the most money is given by people with incomes under $50,000. Because people who have less sometimes have a much greater understanding of the need to give and a heart for giving. I have a colleague who's doing urban ministry in Newark, New Jersey, and the congregation was in a very poor neighborhood, and they gave a job to a homeless man who lived on the street. They said he could come in and live in the church and be the sexton of the church, and they would pay him $80 a week. My friend told me that one time that the man came and said, I need to talk to you, Pastor, because I have a heavy heart. And so she said, okay, and he came in, and she knew that there were a lot of reasons why his heart would be heavy. And so she asked him, and he said, my heart is heavy because whenever I get my $80, I just spend it all. And he said, I want to tithe, and so will you keep $8 from my salary every week so that I know that I can give to God what belongs to God, and then I'll live on the rest. But I don't have very good willpower, so you keep it first. Well, sometimes a heavy heart is a gift from God, and I sometimes think that in our affluence, we shield our hearts from a kind of heaviness that God might give us. We're so eager to escape that kind of thing. And finally, there's a misconception that giving is all about law and deprivation and being forced to give up something that will make us happy and that we won't be happy anymore because we'll be deprived of money. In fact, I think that's one thing that scares people a lot about talking about money in church and the whole concept of giving, because they hold tight to what they have. And that's a very human instinct, to hold tight to what we have. In fact, it's right and it's good. We have a survival instinct. And that's the first skill that we learn. And the idea of relinquishing and giving is the second skill. Have you ever been with a baby and had the baby grab your glasses off your face and try to pry the baby's fingers off? That little kid is strong. And that's what little fingers learn how to do, and that's what lives learn how to do. We learn how to hold tight onto things. And it's only by growing in faith and being a part of a community of faith that we learn the joy and the holiness of relinquishing. And I think the time that really struck me deeply, and this is the last part of this section, but I wanted to share this with you, because when people talk about stewardship, they think so much of having to give up something they need, having to give something away that they'll feel sad about. And I learned something about that from some neighbors that live down the street from us. I have 4 children, I still do, and they are all within 6 years, so I had a very lively household there for a while. And when my kids were growing up, when they were little, there was a couple that lived down the street who didn't have any children. And every once in a while, when I could get a babysitter, I would go down and visit with my friend who lived down the street, walk into her house, and her walls had no fingerprints on it at all. And she had a white couch. They had a white couch. And we would sit on that white couch, and we would look at the Hummel figures lined up on the coffee table in front of us. And we would drink liquids that were not juicy juice and eat things that were not graham crackers. And we would talk about all the wonderful things they were doing in life. They traveled all over the world. They ate out at great restaurants. They did all these kinds of wonderful things. They had books. They had figures. And then the woman got pregnant, which was a joy because they had been trying to have children for a long time. So she got pregnant, and she had a baby boy. His name was David. David was the most active baby I've ever encountered in my entire life. I don't think he ever slept more than 8 hours from the minute he was born. So I remember going down there one time, about a year after David was born, for one of my visits, and it just struck me because I walked in this time, and there was jelly on the wall, you know, and there was a plastic cover over the white couch, and the Hummel figures were gone. And when we talked, and we didn't have adult drinks because we were sharing with David, and they talked about how they were spending their money now. They were spending they started a college fund for him, and there was baby furniture and books all over the place and toys, and they were already looking into preschools. I don't think they had them into Harvard or Yale yet, but they were starting to think about it. And it struck me all of a sudden that their whole lives had been changed and reoriented. They were spending their time in different ways. They weren't sleeping as much at night. They were going to things that you do with babies. And they were spending their money in totally different ways. But they weren't doing it because someone told them they had to, and they weren't feeling deprived. This transformation had taken place because they had a new love in their life, and their lives were being poured out in new ways because of that love. And so as we think about stewardship, what we're thinking about at the base of what stirs people's hearts is when they have a closer and closer relationship with Jesus, that their lives are transformed and reoriented. And those things you talked about that stirred your heart were things that flow from you when your life is reoriented toward Jesus. And that's what stewardship is about most deeply, a reorientation of life. And it takes a long time. Everyone's on a stewardship journey. You can't have, and if you've come today to say, I hope she has the magic program and I'll go home and do it and the giving will double in my church, I'm sorry, it's not going to happen. But we can be on an exciting journey of learning and love with the people in our congregation, using the word stewardship and talking about the things in their lives that are keeping them from having that kind of joy. Okay, now what I'd like to do is we're going to talk a little bit about money now, really specifically. I said that one of the misconceptions about stewardship is that you should never talk about money in church. So we're going to start talking about money. And what I'm going to do is ask you, after I say a couple of things, to ask you to break into groups. And if you want, this would be a chance to stand up and walk around and we'll just do this for about 10 or 15 minutes. There's a table out there you could go, or in the back of the church, or just turn around where you are. But this will be a good chance to stretch and everything. We're going to talk about, first of all, money in our own lives, before we talk about money in church. And as a basis for beginning to think about why we should talk about money and why Jesus says that we should talk about money, because he talked about it all the time. I want to give you one verse from the Bible. That's a verse that I think is a key verse in the Bible related to money and material wealth and our lives of faith. Now, this is a verse. I had a friend in seminary who liked to keep lists. She kept lists all the time, lists of her favorite hymns, lists of her favorite psalms. She kept a list of the top 10 things that she wished Jesus had never said. It changed a lot, but this one was always in the top 3. Matthew 6:24. No one can serve 2 masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Earlier versions of the Bible said mammon. You cannot serve God and mammon. I like that better, because Jesus actually named a power. It was the only power in the world that he named, that he gave a name to. The power, the thing that has the most power to separate us from God. And one of the ways of dethroning money in our lives is just talking about it. It takes away its power when you're not afraid to talk about it in all different contexts in church. So we're going to practice that a little. We're in a church. We're going to talk about money. But we're going to talk about it in ways that's going to be kind of fun. The first thing I want you to talk about, and when you get together, just get into whatever groups you want to get into, just smaller groups, maybe four smaller groups or 5, whatever. That doesn't matter so much. The first thing I want you to start thinking about now and then share in the group is, what is your happiest memory about money? And then you guessed it. What's your unhappiest memory about money? It's going to be 4 things altogether. The third thing is, can you remember how your parents talked about money? And if they talked to you about it, what do you remember about money from life with your parents? And then the last one, which is the most fun. What would you do if right now somebody gave you $100,000? Now, there isn't a right or wrong answer to this. The right answer is not, I would tithe 10% and give it to the church and then give the rest to the poor, or anything like that. Just from your gut, if someone gave you $100,000 right now, what would you do with it? And you can be selfish about it. Just have fun. Just talk about it. Okay, it's almost 20 of 3. Why don't you get up, walk around, get into a group, and why don't we come back at about 5 of 3 together? And we're going to share just a little bit, but mostly I just want you to share with one another these things. Your happiest memory, your unhappiest memory, what you remember from what your parents talked about, and then what would you do with $100,000? People told me yesterday that that's not nearly enough money to have fun with. So if you want to pretend you got given $250,000, go for it. So, okay, off you go. Do some talking. So we've just spent some time talking about money in church. What?
We had to go out in the Arctics to talk.
I think it counts if you're inside, but parking lot conversations don't count. What were some of the things that you either thought or remembered or heard that kind of struck you as just interesting or fun, or what are some of the things that you talked about in these conversations? What did you hear? What got said? Yep.
Growing up, we didn't talk about
Did anybody notice, did anybody growing up talk a lot about money with their parents or have their parents talk to them? No. You did? Yeah. It's pretty unusual, and it's funny. I mean, parents apparently have as much trouble talking to kids about money as about sex. You know, it just doesn't the only thing I remember...
More about money than sex.
Maybe so. Not much about either, not enough. Anyway, what I remember, I just remember my mother putting money in envelopes. She would put the tithe in one envelope, and I remember her talking about robbing Peter to pay Paul, you know, when she moved money around the envelopes. What about some memories about money? Good, bad? What are some? Birthday money?
from grandma's usually.
Yeah, the joy of getting money for a present. Yeah, lots of fun. Yeah.
The unhappy memories stemmed in many cases from comparisons of mine versus yours, or ours versus theirs.
Yeah, comparisons. I was in a workshop once where they asked us to, and we signed up for this, so we knew we were getting into it. They asked us, there were 30 of us, to line up in the room according to our incomes. So we had to ask, and this was a mixed group, not just pastors, but lay people and pastors. And the look on people's faces when they realized, you know, you'd have to ask somebody, so and then just to see it, I mean, that was really hard. Because, you know, sometimes really in many ways in our culture, we're defined by how much we make and what we have. And that's another thing we're battling against when we do ministry, battling against that idea that you're worth what people pay you, as opposed to what you're worth as a child of God. Yeah. Other memories, yeah?
Most of them are relational. It's not so much about the money as the people involved, both good and bad, and the experience.
Yep, interesting. So money isn't really just money, it's really connected to so many other things in our life. And that's a really important insight, because one of the things you need to know when you're doing work in financial stewardship in the church is that you're not talking into a neutral territory. You're saying things into a person's background with money. Good things, bad things. If someone has just come that morning to church from having a fight with his wife about how to spend money and walks into church and hears about money, it's not going to feel very good. And that's not your fault. But everybody comes to church with money baggage. One of the things we like to do in workshops for longer term is have people do a whole money autobiography and talk about what money has meant and does mean in their life now. If people come to church and they're in deep credit card debt, and which they don't particularly come and want to share, and they get asked for money, that won't feel very good to them. So you need to know that it's really important to be able to talk about money in church, but you're going to be encountering a lot of emotions, and a lot of them are under the surface too. People won't know why it's bothering them so much. Sometimes they will and sometimes they won't. My most powerful experience about that I sort of didn't really unpack until years after that, when I started doing more work in stewardship. When I went to seminary, I was known as the slowest learner in New Jersey, because it took me 14 years from the time I started seminary to when I got ordained. And it was because I really wasn't in a hurry. I was raising 4 kids. We lived abroad for a while. I was taking courses. I did it all part-time, and I just gradually moved and finally got to be ordained. So all of these 14 years, I was not only not contributing to the family income of raising 4 kids, I was taking money out of the family income because we were paying tuition for seminary. So now all through this, my husband is saying, you know, we're doing 2 parts of the job of raising this family. This is your money. You know, you're at home with the kids. You're developing a new course of life for yourself. So we shared the decisions about making the money. He didn't give me an allowance. I mean, it was all very equal. He was wonderful about the fact that this was my money too. So I get done seminary, spent a little time waiting, finally got a call, worked part-time for a while, finally got a full-time job in ministry. When I got my first paycheck, I came home and I walked in the house, and I have no idea, well now I know, but at the time I have no idea where it came from. I said to him, I could leave you now, you know. And where it came from was all those years I felt financially subordinate to him. I felt as though it was his money and he had power over me. And I was staying for me and the kids. And that wasn't true in any conscious way. And we just celebrated our 45th wedding anniversary, you know. I didn't want to leave him. So there was this really crazy, powerful thing. I grew up very poor. Not the kind of poor where you're hungry, but the kind of poor where you never have the right kind of clothes and you never eat out and stuff like that. So somewhere inside of me was this fear that I had to do the right things to somehow be in a relationship. And I just, you know, it was all complicated. And I worked that out over time. But that's some of the things you're going to be running into in the congregation. Deep feelings. You're going to be unearthing deep feelings. And you're going to be unearthing fears that people have about not having enough money and giving it away. All kinds of things. I preached a sermon about tithing once in my own parish when I was a parish pastor. And a member of the church, not a real regular member, but he was furious at me, with me. He came up afterwards and he said, the only reason you're preaching about tithing and telling us to give more money is you want to have a higher salary. And I mean, bless his heart, he was honest, right? So I said to him, okay, I'll make you a deal. I said, you think about proportionate giving and be on a journey toward tithing, but don't give any of it to this congregation. You just give it somewhere in the world where you know God is at work, right? So what happened? He got more mad. Because it really wasn't about my salary. It was something inside him about money. And so that's the kind of stuff that you'll encounter. And that's why it's a complicated kind of ministry, but it's an important ministry. I think it's at the heart of our faith. Okay, so this is what we're going to do next. We're going to talk about, and I'm not going to write them down, I'll just tell you, but we're going to talk about the 10 things that I think are critical to do to create a congregational environment that encourages growth in financial stewardship. And I didn't just make these up. These are taken from surveys of congregations that have the highest proportional giving in their congregations. So these are tried and true things. You know that movie, what was the name of it, about the ballpark, if you build it, they will come? Yeah. So if you do this, they will give, you know, I promise. If you do all these things, this isn't rocket science. This is growth in faith and congregational programming. Because what you want to do is you want to create an incubator environment to grow stewards. You can't do it once a year in a financial commitment program. And so this is number one. Stewardship education has to take place year-round in the congregation. It can't be just a one-time thing. It has to be interesting, it has to be varied, it has to be fun. What are some kinds, and it doesn't have to be about financial stewardship all year round. Just so the word gets out there, the word stewardship and living as a steward, what it means to be a steward, what Jesus said. Did you know that Jesus didn't really, Jesus had disciples and he talked about living as disciples, but his primary image of the Christian life in general was the image of the steward. So many stories and parables are about living like a steward. So that means that he thought that was really important. So that has to take place all year round. What are some of the topics, can you think of, that could be included or during the course of the year in a programs about stewardship? What does stewardship mean to you in all different kinds of ways?
Well, in the spring or the fall, when you're doing highway cleanup, that's stewardship.
Absolutely.
You talk about the environment.
the stewardship of the environment. How many ways could we talk about that, and how much do we need it? So stewardship of the environment, but using the word stewardship. You know, they're not afraid of the word steward and stewardship in the corporate world and in the environmental world. We get a magazine called The Woodland Steward at home, and they talk about stewardship in corporations, stewardship of people. So what else? What can you...
Well, we just had God's Hands Our Work Sunday.
Yep,
That is part of it.
yep, that's taking care of the world and people. Justice work is stewardship work. Yeah.
Being a steward of your relationships.
Absolutely.
In the congregation and within
Yep.
our larger community.
Yep. When I talked about we are a gift that God gives to the world, I think God first gives us to our families, and we have to steward those relationships well, and then our community and the world. Yeah. What are some other programs that could come under the heading of stewardship year-round? Estate planning. When you think about talking about money in church, it doesn't always have to be about giving it. I think one of the most valuable things a church can do is sponsor workshops for how to do a budget, how to manage your money. How can you give money to God when you're giving it all to MasterCard? You know, it's not that people don't want to, but they need the skills for how to manage money so it doesn't manage them. So that's the number one thing. There has to be stewardship programming going on in some way all year round. As a pastor, I used to like to talk about money in the spring during Lent instead of in the fall. I talked about it in the fall for the program, but I talked about it during Lent as a way of understanding how can we draw closer to God. And so we talk a little bit about what role money plays in our lives. And so it's important sometimes to talk about money when you're not asking people to give it. Okay? Yeah?
We have an annual garage sale, and to me that's a stewardship experience because you're taking stuff that's basically worthless but giving or selling it cheaply to somebody who could essentially recycle it and use it.
Yep. And see, that's a really great thing for you to say because a lot of things we already do in church and call by other names are really a kind of stewardship. Simplifying your lifestyle is a huge stewardship discipline. And that's partly what you're doing when you have a garage sale. You're purging and simplifying life. And when you declutter your life, sometimes you declutter your heart and your spirit at the same time. And it can all be understood as part of living as a steward, a responsible steward. So that's number one. Number two, and I think these top two are probably the most important. The pastor must be a strong leader in this effort. Pastor doesn't have to run the programs, but the pastor must be a strong leader and articulate the importance of it and talk about money. The pastor should preach about money once in a while. Not all the time, but the pastor should not hesitate to preach about money, and it should always have a biblical base. When a pastor preaches, we don't preach about a budget. All you have to do is preach from the Bible. 1/3 of all of what Jesus said, just pick one of them. They don't come up enough in the lectionary, I don't think. They do sometimes in the fall, but isn't that a shame that the only time it comes up in the lectionary is when you're having to ask people for it? And, it's just, that's, eh. And, I give you permission. You can say that the former Bishop of New England said you didn't always have to preach on the lectionary, so you can blame it on me. But a pastor should preach about it once in a while. Children and youth should very intentionally be included in talk about stewardship and talk about money. Partly because that's part of incubating stewards, growing up with an understanding of what it means to live that way and learning about it. And sometimes children end up being our best teachers because kids kind of get it that the simple stuff is the good stuff. And you don't always, and then, but they get pretty soon caught up in the culture. And so that's a reason why it's really important. And they also, they're adorable little kids, but we're all born as sinners as well as saints. I did a children's sermon once that, gave a lesson that I didn't really expect to give. I was in a congregation visiting somewhere, and I had the children come forward, and I had prepared a whole bunch of Ziploc bags with 10 dimes in each bag. So the children all came forward, and they all sat around me, and I said, I'm going to give something to you that you can keep. It's for you. I'm going to give you something. And I gave them each a baggie with 10 dimes in it. And we talked about how everything we have, God gives to us. That's another thing that could be preached about a whole lot more than it is. All that we have from God. And we don't really believe that in our gut, I don't think, very often. But anyway, so these kids are sitting around, and I gave each one a bag of 10 dimes, and they were pretty excited. And I said, these are your dimes. I'm giving to you the way God gives us all that we have. And I was sitting down there, and I pulled over one of the offering baskets as I was talking, and pulled it over to put it on my lap, because you can see where the sermon was going to go. And so did a little boy that was standing right in the front, that had been the first up there, and he was standing there with this baggie, and he saw me bring over the basket, and he started going like this. And he backed all the way down the center aisle and slid into the pew where his parents were sitting, while all the other little kids took a dime, 1/10 out of their baggie, and put it into the offering basket. And so when we got done and all the kids went back to their seats, I just said, isn't that how we all feel? We'd really rather just take what God gives us and not give back even 10%. So just doing stuff like that all year round is important.
Well, this is not my original idea. I got it from the folks at the Zion Red Lodge.
Yeah.
And Pastor Kim had a reverse offering. And I thought that was a good idea. And I had the kids take an offering plate, and I had the dollar coins.
Mm-hmm.
And I told them, okay, we're going to have a reverse offering. Take and give everyone a coin. And then I told the people who received it, now what are you going to do with this? Think about this. How will you use this gift of God?
Yeah.
So I got feedback that was both very strong and very negative.
Yep. And you will, probably all the time. But that's the important thing, to be creative and to have fun about it, but to do stuff all year long, and to always include children and youth. Teenagers are usually great about that. They'll think it's cool to go to a consignment shop to get their clothes when they're not in the process of bugging you for a brand name. And number 4, just what we've just been talking about, talk about money is common in church in some form. You get used to the fact that you can talk about it. It's not a taboo topic, and we've already talked about many different ways to do that. Number 5, a financial campaign is conducted every year. You just have to do it. You don't have to make it up. You don't have to be creative. You just have to do it. And you can't just send a letter and say, remember, we're going to pick up the envelopes next week. You have to make some effort to challenge people to think about how much they give to God and to challenge them to grow in their giving. Herb Miller, the guy who invented Consecration Sunday, one of the things he used to say that was one of my favorite things, he would say, very few people will be walking down the street one day and say, oh, I should be giving more money to my church, It just doesn't come to mind, unbidden. So our job as congregational leaders is just to provide that opportunity every year, and to interpret it and to talk about what it means, but not in a heavy-handed way, just in a way that says this is just what we do every year. Mark Allen Powell, who wrote the book Giving to God, which I recommend as a good resource to use in the congregation, talks about giving. He talks about a lot of things. He has a lot of great ideas, but he talks about the duty and the delight of giving. We have a duty to support the congregation, but we have a delight in giving too. And we give beyond the duty in delight, and for all the reasons that we've already talked about. And it's really important to when you do the financial campaign, to have a upbeat attitude about it. Consecration Sunday is great because it's a very celebrative thing. There's really only about 5 kinds of programs that you can do. Giving something, bringing something forward at worship, doing some kind of a relay thing. Does anybody still use Pony Express type stuff? Has anybody ever used Pony Express? Am I showing my age? Yeah. But the idea of a relay, passing it around, is good. And you could do an every member visit, or just, well, actually, they're really a fellowship meal. You can gather people for an evening, talk about the mission of the church, do a fellowship meal. There isn't anything new under the sun. You're not going to find it. There's not a magic bullet. You just have to do something, and you have to do it every year. And you have to do it in a way that helps people gradually over the course of the time say, this is a time of the year when we pray and think and celebrate and then move on. You know, it's not beating people up about it. And I like to talk about the attitude of doing it as being really important. And I have the 2 extremes that I think. One is what I call the white shirt strut, and the other is what I call the stewardship slump. And what I mean by the white shirt strut is, it just came to me over time that, you know, when we're in the middle of a political campaign and a candidate is wanting to prove to you how great he is, so he comes in, there's a stage and a lot of music plays, and the candidate, I'm talking about men here, I haven't figured out how the women do it yet, but so he's got on a white shirt, and it's always rolled up a couple times, so he's looking cool and masculine. Sometimes he has a tie, sometimes he doesn't. He has jeans or slacks. He leaps up onto the stage, and he struts across the stage because here's this energetic, wonderful, magnetic person who's going to lead you. Yeah, well, you know, that gets a little old in the political scene, but it's important when we talk about stewardship to not do what I saw one time when I was a supply preacher somewhere. I was there as a supply, so I was presiding and preaching, and there was one line in the bulletin that said, stewardship moment. And I didn't know what that was, but I didn't have to worry about it. They said, you know, that's just going to happen. But I had noticed that there was a man sitting in the front pew that I thought maybe was homeless. You know, he was sitting there like this, all slumped over and sad looking and dejected. So then we got to the place in the bulletin where it said stewardship, and this man in the front pew went, and he got up and walked up to the lectern, and he was the stewardship speaker. You know? He was the poor soul that had been doing stewardship in the congregation for 100 years, and every year, on the same Sunday, he got up, and he literally leaned on the pulpit and said, okay, it's time for stewardship. You know, we're going to give our pledge cards today. So that's what not to do. When you do a financial campaign, you're talking about the vision, God's vision for God's church, for the world, and we get to be a part of it. So you need to communicate a little bit of that excitement. Pledging. Do most people pledge? In this environment, pledging is strongly encouraged, but it's not demanded. Pledging is a way to make your giving into a discipline. You decide, and we don't always call it a pledge nowadays. In fact, that word has a lot of baggage that could be negative. So you might want to call it an estimate of giving, or a statement of intent, or a promise, or a hoped for gift, or whatever you want to call it. But you have to name something that people, because people, it's statistically proven that people in a congregation, you will receive more gifts if people have to write them down and commit to it. And you can even, if people are gun shy of it, you can even have secret pledges. I was in a church once where they did the whole budget this way. They did the whole funding this way. People would make a pledge and write it down and seal the envelope and bring it forward at worship, and it would never be opened. And it would be given back to them the next year to think about and pray about before the next round of pledging. I don't recommend that. But some people in the congregation, some people in the past have been shamed in churches because they've made a pledge and haven't kept it. Shamed sometimes publicly by a list. Here's the list of people who haven't met their pledges yet. or the pastor would come and visit and say, you really need to get your pledge done. Garrison Keeler calls it fleecing your sheep, and we don't want to do that. But it's a spiritual discipline. And in fact, my own journey toward tithing began with an exercise like that, where in different programs, it's good to have a more than 1 week program where people think and pray about it. The 3 most important words in any kind of a financial campaign are P words, prayer first, proportionate giving, think about the proportion, and pledge. So the pastor had turned around one of those charts that we got every year to look at, where your income levels are in one, and percentage on the side, and you're supposed to look and all by yourself just figure out where you're at and commit to how you might want to grow in giving in the year. So I had gotten that chart before, but I had never really looked at it, because I just sort of looked toward it, because I didn't want to know how much, because I knew we were not giving. We were giving what Martin Marty likes to call tooth fairy stewardship. We were giving about as much every week as we gave our kids for the tooth fairy. So the Holy Spirit moved and stirred my heart, and I looked at it and I thought, we're not even on the chart. So I thought, well, I would like to be able to give 1% of our income to now remember, my husband was making all the money at this point. So it was easy for me to make that decision. The hard part was going home and telling my husband that we had just decided to start on the journey to tithing by giving 1% of our income. But bless his heart, even though he had 3 strikes against him, number 1, he's from New England. They're very frugal up there, very, very frugal. And number 2, he worked on Wall Street, where any kind of proportionate giving or sacrificial giving is generally looked upon as a symptom of mental illness. And number 3, he didn't grow up in church. He didn't get baptized until we had all 4 kids and picked a church to join. But I think the Holy Spirit stirred his heart too, and he said, "Okay, let's do that. Let's figure out what 1% would be, and let's give that to the church." And so it took us about 15 years to get to a place where we tithed. And that's what I said, this doesn't happen overnight. People are on a stewardship journey, and God is at work in their lives, and you have ups and downs. Obviously, if you lose your job, you can't give as much. But you're on the journey, and you're thinking about it, and you're growing in the way that you give. And it really is a journey of joy. And we need to challenge people to get on that road and to be on that journey. So pledging is pretty important. I think of the tithe, I really don't think of tithing as a financial thing. I think of the tithe as a tool for transformation. There aren't very many people who've given proportionately and tithed who, if they could do it, have stopped tithing. Not too many former tithers. Number 7, in this environment, there have to be, especially nowadays, varieties of ways of giving. People have to be able to give in all different kinds of ways. I grew up with a box of envelopes, put it in every week, went to church every week. People don't always go to church every week nowadays. You're wasting your money maybe for some people for boxes of envelopes. You have to have a variety. Young people, I have 4 grown kids, and I don't think any of them have a checkbook. They don't write checks. So you have to be creative and think about who are the people who are giving in the congregation and how can they give. My fantasy church, I've got a great fantasy church that I'll never have, but is that, every pew on the end has a place where you can swipe a card. So you just get moved by the sermon and you lean over it. Well, that's probably not going to happen, but I did meet a pastor who has a kiosk in a big church, a kiosk in the narthex, where you can swipe a card.
Or if you have a church website, you could have a PayPal or credit card.
Absolutely.
We just started a few months ago electronic giving, monthly
Yep.
automatic withdrawal givings that the Synod has, or the ELCA has an approved group that does this.
Yep.
And churches.
I think, is that the one called Simply Giving? Is that the program? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's fabulous.
Well, that was
Yeah.
great, except for one thing. then we get a letter back saying, okay, I think 1.5% of what you go through Simply Giving will be deducted to finance the Simply Giving.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and that got a lot of folks, including me, a little
Yeah.
pissed off, so.
Yeah. Well, you know, we're not going to ever do anything all right, but we have to keep trying ways to encourage people to give. People can give in stock. Somebody just gave, you know, I think campaigns are wonderful because campaigns make people think. There's a synod campaign to build a new synod house. There's an ELCA campaign to do, campaigns are fundraising, but it's a way to give money to God's work in the world. And there's all kinds of ways of giving, but there's someone in Nebraska giving a major gift to the campaign in grain futures. Does anybody know what that is? Yeah. It's something about if you have a lot of grain and how you can, it's something very technical that I don't understand. But the point is, you really need to explore ways and things that people to give. Remember the story from Exodus? People brought all kinds of things. And we have to think about that too. What are things people can give and what are the ways they can give them? Gifts of stock are pretty common. There are people who might not want to give on a more regular basis because they want to use their pre-tax money, so they might give more. And then you have a bunch of problems. In fact, my daughter had this problem because they gave less frequently, and she said, but every Sunday I feel guilty when the collection plate goes by because I don't put something in, and I feel like people are looking at me, and I feel like I'm doing it wrong. And I said, no, you're not doing it wrong, but we have to think about those kinds of things. One congregation that I know of, when you walked in the church, there was a basket in the front that had cards. And so you, for example, if you gave I give to my church monthly. I still write checks, but I do it on a monthly basis. And so in this church, when you walked in, you got a card, and you could just write something on that card, like whatever, just some way of giving that you felt that week, like, or just, I came to church today and I thank God for that. You just write something, but when the plate comes around, you can put that in. So if you're feeling guilty about not putting something in, you have something to put in. You know, we're all human and we have our things, and we have to realize how people feel, how their feelings are, and pay attention to that. Number 8. The focus in all of this needs to be on the giver to give. The focus on the giver to give rather than the church to receive. Because that's what it's all about, really. The reason we do all this is because one of the things it means to be created in the image of God is we're created in the image of the giving God. God loves and God gives. That's what God does. And that's what we are called to do. When we say we want to be godlike, we need to give. So that's our life of faith. Yeah.
And I think that goes back to the mindset of abundance or the mindset of scarcity. If the church needs to receive because there's a need, that's scarcity.
Mm-hmm.
But if you get to give out of your abundance, it's a whole different attitude.
Yep. It really is. And that's the pastor and the leadership can really create that. That's part of the atmosphere you want to create, that we do have abundance. I mean, I've lived in India and I've lived in Africa. I still, to this day, half of the time that I walk into an American supermarket, my stomach turns over because I almost can't stand the abundance. Even those of us who are struggling in this country have abundance. And if we don't have material abundance, we have other kinds of abundance to share. But you're absolutely right, and that's critical, and that can be, if you keep telling people again, we are blessed by God, and the giving is out of abundance. It doesn't really matter the amount. The amount doesn't matter. What matters is understanding that God has blessed us abundantly, and we give from that abundance. Not because our church is going down the tubes, and if we don't give it money, it's going down. The church will never go down the tubes, ever. Congregations come and go, pastors come and go, we come and go. The church is forever. Jesus is forever. And we do what we do while we're here to make God's will and God's purpose known in the world through our congregations and our own lives. And that's another important thing to remember, that this whole stewardship thing isn't just about the church. And, you don't become a good steward by being on 6 committees. I mean, that's good, but maybe not. Maybe that's not being a very good steward. But primarily, most lay people are stewards in their lives. They give as teachers, they give as bankers, they give as people who work on farms. That's the stewardship going on, and that's how they give, and that needs to be celebrated as well. Number 9, a simple little thing. Lots and lots of people need to be involved in this. You can't have a stewardship team of 3 people and do all this. There are 2 reasons for saying lots of people have to be involved. Number 1, it'll give you a lot more gifts and creativity and people to share the load. Number 2, when you get more people involved in it, more people learn about what it means to be a steward by doing the programs. Some congregations that I've known use their congregation council as the stewardship team because it's so important in the life of faith that they use council time to plan the stewardship program. Stewardship teams should include many, many more people than just financial people. We need financial people to do stuff, but you only need a couple of financial people to run the financial part of the campaign. The rest of the campaign should be made up of educators and dreamers and tithers and visionaries and lay people willing to talk about why they tithe, people with exciting creative ideas for programming. That should be the team. And finally, number 10, which is maybe the most important thing, is we should say thank you about 100 times more than we think we need to. We should always be thanking people because that's just the way that people are drawn more and more into feeling appreciated and drawn more and more into letting go of their fear and wanting to become part of the program. So, and speaking about program, I want to do one more thing and then with you, and then kind of open it up for questions for the rest of whatever time we have together. And I want to talk about when you do a financial commitment program in the congregation. These are the 5 things. I was looking for this before. There's curriculum all over the place. There's curriculum on the ELCA website. There's a Consecration Sunday program. That just is a very effective tool. Its origins are in the Baptist church, so you may want to redo a little of theology, like God doesn't love you more when you give more. Just be careful for things like that. But there's lots of resources. George, who introduced me, George Karras, is one of his hats that he wears in the Synod is to work with congregations and with people on stewardship and mission support. So he can, if you want to know where to go for resources, he could help you do that. But there's really, and let me know if I'm wrong about this, but there's really only 5 models. Bringing pledges forward in some form after some kind of work, bringing pledges forward in worship, a fellowship meal, people gather, have a meal, celebrate, give their commitments, this relay kind of thing. I think that's kind of fun. You might be spread out too far to do it. It's just fun. You can have a good time with it. Home gatherings. I think that's one of the most effective ways if you have the time and energy to plan that extensive of a campaign. Because it's easier for people to think and talk about this in small groups than in bigger groups. And home visitations. And I don't really think it works very well to ask lay people to ask other lay people for money. I don't think we want to ask one another for money. We might want to ask people for a pledge, or a card, a commitment, but we have to honor the concerns and the fears about money and the privacy. We have to constantly be working about it, but we always have to honor how people feel, because if a person has a bad history of money experiences, you might want to put them off. But you can always celebrate it in some fashion, and you should always have pledging be a part of it. And I did this yesterday. I knocked the whiteboard over, so that's why I'm being careful. So how do you plan a financial commitment program in a congregation? I think one of the, not dangers, but one of the ways we can get worn out or get discouraged is if we don't understand who the target audience is that will be hearing this. And this is the way someone explained it to me once that I think is really helpful. Almost every congregation, and of course there are exceptions, there's exceptions to everything, but almost every congregation, about half of the people are what I would call inactive. They may show up to church once in a while, they may be Christmas, Easter people, but they're not a regular, ongoing part of the life of the congregation. And the biggest, I think one of the biggest mistakes people make in planning a financial commitment program is that they target it at the inactives. I don't know how many meetings I've been in where they said, now if we visit all our inactive families, and if they would all pledge just $10 a month, we could solve our church's financial problems. Don't do that. Keep that in mind. Most congregations have a core, varies between 10 and 20% of the congregation, but that's the core of the congregation. Those are the faithful people, the pillars, they give generously, the tithers are in this group, and you don't need to preach to the choir. So the core will be there. However, you shouldn't exclude them when you think about the financial commitment program. I had a colleague who was planning to preach about on a financial commitment Sunday and encourage everybody to grow in their giving. But he had one member of the congregation, an older woman, a retired woman, an elderly woman, whom we'll call Mabel, who lived on a very limited income and who tithed and gave beyond her tithe. She was just one of those saints, you know. I've had them in every congregation that I've been in. It's just a blessing. So he was worried about Mabel because she tithed and gave so much more. So he went to visit her before the Sunday before he was going to preach. And he said, Mabel, now I'm going to preach on Sunday, and I'm going to passionately ask people to grow in their giving, but I don't want you to listen. He said, I don't want you to grow in your giving because I think you give enough to the church. Let other people share the burden. And she said, Pastor, don't take away my joy. She said, if I want to grow in my giving, I will. So you just preach and let me and God decide when I'm going to give. You know, those are the people that make us glad we became pastors. 20 to 25% of most congregations are what I would call the responsible component. They're not the core, you know, they're not there all the time and doing everything, but they do a lot, and they're sort of the backbone of the church. They're very responsible, and they're there when you need them. And then I know this isn't going to add up to 100, but if you pick a number out of each thing, you can make it add up to 100. 20 to 25% is what I would call responsive. And what this group of people is, they're a group of people that have responded to something that's gone on in their life and in the life of the church. Somehow they've come into contact with the church, and that's brought them there. Maybe they've come in from the inactives. Maybe they've been sick and they decided they want to be in church more. Maybe the pastor has been with a family in the community in grief, done a funeral, and the family said, you know, we want to be in church. We want to be connected to church. So they're there. They're not quite in the responsible group, but they're there and they're kind of listening very carefully and aware of what's going on in the church. And the way you can tell the difference between all these groups is And families in these groups, what they do when Aunt Mary comes to visit. So Aunt Mary comes to visit them on a weekend. The inactives will say to Aunt Mary, "What do you want to do on Sunday?" The responsives will say to Aunt Mary, "We just found this church. Would you be interested in going to church with us on Sunday?" The responsible will say, "Aunt Mary, we're leaving for church at 9:30. Let us know if you want to come." And the core will say, "Aunt Mary, be ready to go to church by 9:30. So when you're doing a financial campaign, that's who you structure it for. You structure it, and of course, other people will hear it. But you don't structure it to bring back all the inactives, because a financial campaign will not do it. A pledging stewardship program won't do it. The core doesn't need it. The responsible don't need it, although they will be listening, and they will hear some of it. And probably, here's where you'll get most of the growth in your giving, frankly. But these are the people who are really ripe to grow in their faith, because they're there for some reason. God has put them a little off-center and brought them to a place where they're open. And so think about stirring people's hearts with your financial campaigns, not getting money for the church. And think about these people, that if you don't touch them, they might slip back into inactive. But if you can stir their hearts, they're going to be moving into the life of the church in ways that will help them grow, but will also help the church grow. Okay? Okay, now we've got 15 minutes. We can either stop and you can go outside and enjoy the weather, but I'd be happy to talk about anything else you might want to talk about for a few minutes. Are there any questions or anything you'd like to share? Yeah.
I just didn't catch the name of your author of Giving to God. Oh, no.
Oh, the question is, who is the author for the book Giving to God? Mark Allen Powell. And there's another book that's out there that's really interesting. Those of you who are doing financial stewardship work in the congregation, and I'm blanking on the author's name, but the title of the book is Not Your Parents' Offering Plate. And it's a book that helps think about what younger generations and what people outside the church, how they might be touched and brought, and the reasons why they would be willing to give, and how they can be motivated to give in ways that are new and really touch where they are. Because some of us, commitment to an institution is at the heart of what we do, and that's just not so true anymore for a lot of people. And we have to honor that and think about what is going on in their lives. Just, and regular giving is really, really important, but occasional giving and spontaneous giving is going on in our world. The Ice Bucket Challenge. I'm not suggesting you all go home and do ice buckets in your congregation, but people want to give. I mean, that's what that told me. People want to give to something that they're convinced is important. So our job is to convince them how important the church is for their giving. Yeah.
What about stewardship?
I'll repeat the question. Would you say that again?
What about stewardship? The relationship between stewardship and capital campaigns and outside assistance in specifically capital campaigns.
By outside assistance, do you mean bringing in a group to help raise money? Yep. First of all, just to clarify what you've already said, there's a difference between our regular stewardship giving, the way we give to the church, and efforts that we make to raise funds. And that can be for secular things, but we also do fundraising in the church. I think history shows that as long as it's not way off the charts in cost, you generally get more money when you bring in an outside group to do fundraising. And the reason for that is they have the expertise and they know all the things to do, and they can help you do them. If you have to invent it yourself, you'll probably get so worn out and probably not do as well as if you brought in experts. So for major fundraising, I would say it's wise to consider an outside group. But when you do, and having said that, I've done it both ways in my congregations. And I just experienced that when we used an outside group, we had a struggle with people complaining that we were spending some of the money on the outside group. But they just knew how to run it in a way that generated ultimately more income for the funds we were raising. So.
That author is J. Cliff Christopher.
Thank you. Christopher is the last name, J. Cliff. He's written other books too. That's the most recent one, and it's really interesting. It's a really easy read. It's very short, but has a lot of good tips. What? $12.56 on Amazon. You know. Yeah. Any other questions or things you'd like to share or talk about before we leave? Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming today. And thank you for being a part of this ministry. I don't know if you know this, but people who work in stewardship get more stars in their crown in heaven than anybody else. So you're all set. But thank you.